Matt has recorded with the Dissidents before, but Stephen is a new guest, and we thank you for coming here to talk about your article, Embracing Our Values, and then after the colon, Social Work Progressivism in a Conservative World. And it was published in what journal? International Journal of Social Work Values and Ethics. We will link to it in the podcast notes. And you do have two other co-authors, Michael Hassler and Brendan Young, right? So before we get started, Matt's going to do the honors of the...
Very good. The viewpoints of the contributors of this podcast are entirely their own and do not represent their employers or affiliates.
So, Stephen, Matt and I read this article together, and first of all, we want to say, it's great that, this is obviously work that needed to be done. So I think the best thing to do, because Matt and I already sort of talked about this article, is for you to just briefly summarize what you did and what you found. So I'll let you tell the story instead of us telling the story of what we think your article was about.
Great. So this article was a piece of a larger study. The larger study, the main focus of that was looking at full-time social work faculty members in the United States, looking at their conceptualization of poverty, what they saw as the causes for poverty and solutions to poverty. But within that, in the demographic questionnaire, I asked a series of questions because I figured that they would be, with the demographic questionnaire being the independent variables, that they would influence the viewpoints on understanding of that social problem. And so two of the questions that were asked one was a scale of kind of a 7-point scale of the liberal to conservative continuum, with 1 being extremely liberal and 7 being extremely conservative, and different markers along the way for them to answer that. Another question was about political affiliation, Republican, Democrat, etc., political affiliation. And so that was part of that study. But what was interesting with it was there's this whole other body of literature related to political ideology, political affiliation, and social work. And most of the literature that's found is about students. I guess faculty members survey their students a lot. And so they look at students' viewpoints around those ideas. And then there is some literature related to social workers, social work practitioners, and their viewpoints politically. But there's next to nothing written about social work faculty. And being in social work education and social work faculty, I thought that was a good point to capture, considering that it was a representative sample and there were over 1,000 respondents. And so what the findings were, what was anticipated was that it would be heavily leaning liberal, and that would be heavily Democrat in terms of political affiliation. And that was exactly what it was. And there was every indication that that's what it would be based upon previous literature and based upon other things. I wasn't expecting anything different than that. And so then the other piece of it was not just the descriptive of being able to say, hey, here's a decent sized study where we have information about what affiliation they have and where they see themselves ideologically. But there was another piece was in how does that influence their social welfare policy preferences? And, we can get into the definition of what ideology is and everything. Obviously, it's going to influence it because that's part of ideology is how you understand the world, how you make sense of things, and these pieces. So it would influence policy preferences, and so their policy preferences were very much more progressive preferences as opposed to restrictive. And the progressive restrictive was the language used by the author that developed the scale. So I continued using that language there. You could say progressive conservative, but they use progressive restrictive. And so we had some information about that, and then say, okay, and so what does this mean, right? What are some implications of this in terms of where faculty are coming from? And so we looked at, in terms of, this is the Journal of Social Work Values and Ethics, looking at CSWE, looking at NASW in terms of the Code of Ethics, looking at other literature related to the profession, and said, the students, the practitioners, the faculty, and depending upon interpretation, which I'm sure we're going to get into, with the code and other things, seem to be leaning in a direction. It seems to be directional and not necessarily neutral, and that direction is more towards a liberal understanding and value base than a conservative one. Not that it's exclusive, not that it's a zero-sum game, but that it is more in line with that perspective. And so that's what the article was about, and I'm sure there will be questions and other things, so I'll pause for that to kind of figure out where the two of you want to go with this in terms of questions that you'd have or areas that you want to focus in on.
Yeah.
In terms of, I have a few sort of like, I guess before we get too much into the meat of it, I just had a few questions like, you may not know the answer to this because it may be too long ago, but I don't think you reported the age range of the participants. Do you remember, or am I missing it somewhere?
No, I didn't.
Okay, that's fine. I just wondered because of another question. So I didn't know if you remembered that or not.
Well, I can.
You can look that up real quick.
I can look that up here to get the full demographic piece, because I asked things from region of the country, type of university that it would be in. I asked all sorts of things because in the initial study, in looking at ideas around poverty, I also asked very specific questions of their experience, their lived experience from birth to 18 within poverty, if they had utilized certain welfare programs, if they had housing insecurity, food insecurity, other types of things related to that or not. It was upwards of 80% had reported no experience whatsoever with poverty growing up, which is interesting in a profession that the first line in the Code of Ethics says we pay particular attention to the needs and empowerment, of those who are oppressed, discriminated against, and living in poverty. And yet, if 70-something% said that they had not experienced any poverty from 0 to 18, well, we know that is very much less than the general population. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at the poverty rates of children in the United States, not just cross-sectionally year by year, but if you do cumulative over those 18 years, it's a very normative experience to experience that. So the faculty are less, anyhow, so that's a different.
Well, no, I think that's important. I was, so I was kind of interested in their age and the time that they'd spent in the field, like as a social worker or whatever. But I think that's really interesting because we're seeing lots of ways in which social work faculty don't necessarily represent the kinds of people that they're interacting with in the field then, because most of the country
certainly,
also isn't
racially,
progressive, right? And most of, and racially and those,
So I actually just pulled it up directly. I could give you if you were interested. 18% were full professors, 32% were associate professors, 33% assistant professors, 5% clinical professors, 4% a lecturer, 4.5% an instructor. Average age, 18.7% were between ages of 20 to 40.
Oh, so really young. Okay.
So that was 18%.
Oh, 18%. Okay.
57.6% were between 41 and 60, and 23.6%, almost a quarter, were between 61 and 80. So you had a pretty good range of ages.
So
actually.
that gets to that. That becomes relevant here in a minute to a question that I had. One thing was I noticed you had like a 17% response rate. That is huge. I mean, that is really good. I mean, 10% is like have a party for 10%. Do you have any idea why you got such a high response rate?
Well, ultimately, self-selection is the determining factor.
Yeah.
And I said this was a survey about faculty views on poverty. So that might have sparked some people's interest.
Yeah, that's what I wondered, how it was presented to people.
However, even with the faculty interest in poverty, I asked them what their primary area of practice is, their primary area of interest, and other things. And work with poverty was not the top area. But
even though that was kind of part of the advertisement, if you will.
Even though that was the topic of the survey, was to understand better their views on poverty. Yeah.
So you got rid of some predictors. And so were those some of the things that you're talking about right now? Because you did mention that you basically you ran some statistics like, a bunch of stuff wasn't predictive, right? So you got rid of, you found 7 predictors. So I don't know how many.
Yeah. So what I did
originally.
Was when I did the initial correlations, right, I just loaded everything.
Right.
To see what in the correlation matrix, which was, ginormous, to see what was significant or not. And only those things that were significant did I pull those and then run the regression from that.
So I'm going to kind of nitpick here because to me, that feels a lot like phishing, number one. But I understand this was like the first, it was the first pass at something that you don't really know what you're going to find, right? So those 7 predictors ended up explaining 16.2% of the variance. And the main reason I'm suggesting this is the main reason I'm kind of bringing this up is because we're not explaining a lot of the variance with these quasi-experimental variables, right? Like these are people putting themselves in groups, basically by nature of their gender, their, political affiliation and everything. So I think that's relevant because we're sort of, you're engaging in a descriptive analysis and a correlational regression analysis with potentially a whole bunch of variables, and we get down to 7 variables and they explain 16.2% of the variance. So I think in some ways that's good. I think it's good that these quasi-experimental, these sort of individual difference variables are not explaining vast amounts of people's eventual ideas about social work, right? I mean, it's kind of weird for me to say that I think it's good that that there's a lot more it's like, we can't say that, oh, women, it's like, oh, being female explained all kinds of, variants, or like you said, coming from, poverty explained a whole bunch. So I think it's kind of, it shows the, like you said, the diversity, of your sample, that you're not explaining vast amounts of variance in people's feelings about the field of social work. But I think it's interesting, and I think that this is relevant to the distribution. So Matt and I wondered what you thought about why so on your restrictive social policies, being liberal was significantly negatively associated. No big surprise there, right? So liberal ideological views significantly negatively predicted restrictive social policies, but political affiliation did not. But then when we get to the progressive social policy preferences, political ideology positively predicted that, and so did political affiliation. And I think, we kind of wondered aloud well, let me ask you, do you make anything of that, or do you think it's just spurious,
I think part of it, I know you're linking to the article in the notes of this, but the percentage, if you will, that when we look at political affiliation, right? I'm trying to scroll to that. Where are we with the percentage?
Yeah, I'm on page 203 of the journal article, so I don't know if that's helpful or not.
So 78% affiliated with the Democratic Party. I believe it was like 4%, if I can find it, that affiliated with Republican.
Correct.
There was the difference between that was about 10% said independent, which doesn't necessarily show any direction, right? I mean, with independent, you could be more liberal leaning, you could be more conservative leaning.
Yeah.
Even with saying Democrat or Republican doesn't always necessarily mean where you are ideologically. And so it was about 10% was independent. I think around 4% was conservative, or it was Republican, and then whatever the remaining difference is was other, like they picked something else.
Mm-hmm.
So I think because it was so strongly Democratic, as opposed to so minimally otherwise, and then with the kind of you don't know necessarily which direction with the independent, I think that might have something to do with it. So I don't think it was entirely spurious or just, yeah.
Well, I mean, when you have that many, because again, it's possible when you have that many variables, it's possible that there's some that are going to show up as significant or not, just simply because of the vast number. But we did think it was interesting, and we kind of wondered aloud if that had anything to do with the age of the participants, because we were thinking, oh, well, being Democratic wasn't negatively associated with the restrictive social policies, but it was positively linked to the progressive social policies.
Yeah.
And so we just kind of wondered aloud at the time if when we talked about it, whether it's a little bit of an age thing. If people have been in the field for a long time, you just get kind of worn down and feel maybe a little bit, maybe you're a little bit less charitable in some ways. So we just wondered about the age. And so the fact that you did have so many older, I don't know, are most social work educators former field, they used to be in the field?
I think it just depends. If I would imagine at most, like R01 universities, They might have more of the folks that kind of just went right through. It might not have as much practice experience because they're more researchers and much more academicians than necessarily practitioners. But there is, in my experience, I've worked at a handful of different schools, there's a good mixture of people that have been in the field for 20, 30 years, and then this is a second career or that type of thing, or at least have some practice experience in terms of people that have LCSWs. Well, you have to have worked in the field and you have to have had so many hours in those things, and oftentimes they will have continuing some form of a practice, some type of private practice or some consultation or other ongoing work. So there's a decent amount of practice experience that faculty bring.
Yeah, I would just be, you have plenty of great data, so you can continue. You said this is only part of a study, so I'm sure you're looking at lots of other aspects of the data. There's lots of rich data there, I think.
This was my dissertation.
Oh, well, congratulations on getting your
my
dissertation published.
This was my first attempt at research. So I, in no way, you don't have to, kind of say, I'm not trying to say that maybe you're fishing or this or that, that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we can all handle it here. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. You're not going to say anything that reviewer number 2 hasn't already said, and it'll be fine. I'm not offended in any way. But yeah, so maybe there was a little bit of fishing because this was a first attempt. But no, there's been other things I've used the dissertation for, but this was one thing in particular that we thought when there's a gap, when if nothing else, is this in some ways confirming what we might assume? Well, but there's not really studies that have talked about that. So
right.
Yeah.
So we just kind of wondered if maybe, this sort of, you can have sort of the progressive sort of, a liberal ideological view and be a Democrat, and maybe over time become sort of less forgiving maybe of certain groups. And that's what we kind of wondered, whether there was something going on there. So, maybe someday that's something you can mess around with. So we read the first part of the article and we were like, woohoo. And then we got to the second part of the article, and that's where we felt a little confused. I say we, but especially me, I think more than Matt. And I should say, like, I'm in psychology. I'm not, and I'm a experimental psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. Matt is the social worker. So I was reading this. Well, first of all, it's in the International Journal of Social Work Values and Ethics. And so we knew that it had to go beyond your survey, your descriptives. We knew it was going to go beyond that. To me, I was surprised at the second half of the article. So, again, to me, which is not necessarily fair, because I read mostly psychology journal articles. It felt, it felt almost like we flipped to the other side. So we're doing this descriptive study, and then it's like, it became more of an editorial piece or an opinion piece to me. And I wondered, I couldn't help but wonder if you were encouraged to go there by either, now that I know this is your dissertation, either by your dissertation committee or by the journal editors. If you were encouraged to say, we should be pushing progressive ideas by either a journal editor or a a dissertation advisor?
It was not by a dissertation advisor. It was not by a journal. The comments and reviewer comments didn't turn up or turn down the volume at all. We were encouraged to do this by the three of us. So that was our ideas.
So I'm gonna quit talking now because I think Matt probably wants to jump in. Now we've established that, so Matt probably wants to jump in.
Oh, very good, very good. No, it was very interesting, and the things that we've been working on over the last little while, another colleague and myself, involves political and viewpoint diversity in social work. So when we found this article, we were very appreciative, and think there's definitely a valuable contribution that you've made here, and want to thank you for that. When we think about viewpoint and political diversity, this what you found was not surprising in a lot of ways, but I wondered if we've kind of developed some premises and some thoughts, and they're different than what you developed in the second part of the article. And so I think this is just where there's an opportunity for a helpful, rich discussion just from different perspectives on this. And the recommendation were, you mentioned two steps. And one is that we embrace progressive values on one hand, but at the same time, it seemed like you wanted to kind of moderate that as well by suggesting we should not be engaging in groupthink. We should not be marginalizing people with different values and so forth, although we do embrace the progressive values. Did
Yes.
I capture that right? Is that kind of what your intent was?
No, that captures that, and when I say you in this, I'm not talking specifically to you and for you to,
Sure.
For either of you to have to respond to this, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you, or say one person, can you have ideological views? I think we all do, right? We all have different, whether you call them worldviews or these types of views. And can you have those, but have to temper those in a somewhat, right? Because it's not as if just because you have these views that you go all out in trying to. It doesn't mean that you don't also see other people's point of views. It also doesn't mean that just because you have these views that you then stifle others' views, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know it seems like there's kind of, in me rereading it, it seems like, okay, so we go here and then we come back, and then we go here and then we come back a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about social work practice in general, right?
Yeah.
And you look at through the Code of Ethics, you look at through the EPOS from the Council on Social Work Education, that also kind of has that pattern, right?
Yeah.
Where we have our own views, and self-awareness is greatly emphasized, and competency of understanding others on a very long list and host of ideas, including political belief, is part of that. But yet, we are to uphold the profession's ethics and standards. So there's a moderating that takes place. One of the things that we're kind of saying in here is, based upon our understanding of the literature, based upon our understanding of where students, practitioners, faculty, curriculum, direction from professional organizations are, it is much more compatible with a more liberal ideological view.
Mm-hmm.
So why would we not embrace that if all the currents are going in that direction generally?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mostly, not exclusively, and not
Sure.
only, but generally
Sure.
in that direction. So it's not to say that you exclude others or exclude other viewpoints, but it's pretty clear through all currents going in one direction that you would embrace that way of doing things, but not to where you are all the way left, cut off to any viewpoint, cut off to any seeing the value in other things, cut off to, only toe the line, that type of thing.
But it does feel like when you say educators must also ensure that academic freedom is not merely an ideal, but a practice within departments and institutions which will enable professors to maintain fidelity to their own guiding principles. I feel when I read this paper that you are advocating for academic freedom so long as it is progressive. So you're very clear that threats are from the right. You say that specifically. Existential threats are coming from the right. So that, if we go along with that, you say prepare to have pedagogy and curriculum criticized. The threat comes from the political right. And then, so you're very concerned about critical race theory, and so believe me, so are we. But I don't know that I see that balance that you're saying that you have, because we come to an example where a student who can't come around should not graduate with a degree in social work. You imply that. You say that, I can read the exact quote, but, the profession and the social work academy must determine when the formal educational process is ended and the gatekeeping responsibility begins. And that feels like you either get with the progressive program, or you need to get out. And I'm not sure, maybe you didn't mean that, but that's how I read it.
There's always a, written into the curriculum, is within the accreditation standards and other things, there is a process where I think in the past they used the term gatekeeping, and they're not as savvy to want to use that anymore. But there's a process where, is it merely that people can, do well on tests and grades and things like this, but,
Exactly.
There's usually an interview.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Matt.
You have the soft skills, the interpersonal skills, the critical thinking skills, not just doing well academically.
Yeah, so that as well, and that if pretty much every program says, as far as supporting and upholding, the code of ethics, right?
So are the code of ethics then only compatible with progressive views?
They are not only compatible with progressive views. The field of social work is not only compatible with progressive views. I would argue that it is mainly or more on the side of being compatible with progressive views than conservative views, but it's not exclusive to that. And many things, could be considered neutral. We talk about, towards the end, I think, in this, something I was reading today, we talk about that how things have become so divisive to where almost everything is political. Even things that before were seen as non-political now is considered, a political choice. Even if you think about just consumerism, political choice. I personally drink no alcohol whatsoever. That's just a personal choice of mine. But, people in an uproar of, well, now I can't drink Bud Light because they had a flag on Bud Light, or the fact that they have flags on Bud Light. That could also be something. Or they say, well, now I can't do this, or, well, I'm not going to go to Chick-fil-A.
Right.
Because that's associated with certain things. And so, we make everything politicized.
Sure.
Not everything is politicized. Not everything needs to be politicized, but it becomes that way. So is everything in the code of ethics necessarily compatible with, a liberal viewpoint? No. Yeah. Is everything compatible with a conservative viewpoint? No. But I would argue that it leans more and has more compatibility with a liberal viewpoint than a conservative viewpoint.
Very good. So let me ask you. You asked, well, why not embrace kind of the predominant? Why not embrace what is most common? The leaning, going with the flow of liberal progressive values in social work. I think it's a really good question. And I would one of the things that we want to encourage in enhancing viewpoint diversity is we are concerned about censorship. We are concerned about self-censorship as well. And I guess the question that we would ask is, we see the clear threat from the right. The question now is, that I'd be really interested in your thoughts on, is when might there be a threat from orthodoxy on the left?
Of course. One of the reasons, and it is not solely self-interest, but one of the reasons why it makes sense as a pro-social worker, it makes sense to guard against threats from either side.
Exactly.
Because it just, that's one of the things that we talk more about from the ideological perspective, not as much party affiliation perspective, because it depends upon who the party leaders are at the time. Mm-hmm. It depends upon what the platforms are, and platforms change and parties change over time. And there could be threats from both sides. I mean, or from all sides, not both, but from all sides. And we do have to be critical in looking at that and saying, okay, in light of, for instance, if we're looking at the Code of Ethics, the very often cited 6.04, because it says social and political action, right, is the heading for it. If I'm looking at B, it says social workers should act to expand choice and opportunity for all people with special regard for vulnerable, disadvantaged, oppressed, and exploited people and groups. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, if we look at that just as that statement, that is not always partisan. Mm-hmm. I think in recent era of time, when I say recent, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, in recent decades of time, expanding choice and opportunity for all people with particular regard for that list has been primarily, but not exclusively, more of a more left perspective, as opposed to conservative, by definition of what conservative, like the actual definition. And when we go to even your, basic political science texts and definitions of what these terms mean, would be not as open to expanding choice and rights and opportunities to
But
folks.
If they're already in the program, they must be, right? I mean, if they've joined a social work program, if they're getting an advanced degree in social work, or if they're an undergraduate degree, they're already not as progressive. So they feel the calling of social work, whatever that is. Should they be welcomed into a program and graduate without being sort of reprogrammed into more progressivism? I mean, even if they're just sort of central right or center left, if they're not progressive, are they not a good fit for social work at all?
No, I didn't know. They
Okay.
can still be in social work.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not arguing that social workers need to be far left perspective. And at some point in time, there was a very large middle ground. That middle ground is almost completely evaporated.
Exactly.
Things have become very polar.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that if we're looking at kind of classic conservatism, classic liberalism, and then we're looking at neoconservatism and neoliberalism, and then we're looking at some of these other ideas, the classic conservatives are very hard to find. The classic liberals are very hard to find anymore. But classic conservatives and classic liberals used to have a lot more common ground. Exactly. And even though there was differences, and even though it still would have been more, in my mind, historically, value-wise, otherwise, more in line with a liberal perspective, conservatives also, even you can look at Nixon, right? I mean, Nixon continued on for some time, maybe begrudgingly, but continued with some of the programming from, the Great Society and some of that type of programming, and the welfare budget, despite what he was saying, grew under Nixon. So, some things like that. Well, Nixon's probably the last classic conservative in terms of administration that we had. So we're talking about today and talking more contemporary, but
sure.
There's a continuum.
There is, and most actually, I mean, I would argue that the research suggests that most people are more central, that there's, like if you look at the Hidden Tribes report and, many other research studies find that most people are actually more in the center, are social work graduates prepared to work with people who are center or to the right? Are they getting the right preparation to work with people who aren't like them?
Yes. In terms of, so what this was looking at the academic side, primarily looking at faculty in the education side. Now, in terms of in practicing social work, and in terms of working with all client populations and what they bring, there is your individual values that you have, and then there's professional values that you have, right? There's the individual and there's the professional. On the professional side of things, we could go through a lot of differences. I went through in preparation about 20 minutes before we started. I was like, let me just highlight every area of the Code of Ethics that deals with political belief.
Right.
That deals with political belief.
You bet.
And,
Calling,
in terms of standards to clients, 1.05D, understanding of political belief, is one of the many, many things listed in diversity of having competence and understanding of that, which would entail not just understanding for of your own, but other people. You have to know other people. 1.06B, do not exploit clients for political interests. Okay. To our colleagues, under respect, 2.01B, it talks about not having unwarranted negative criticism of political belief.
Yeah, boy, that's what I've definitely seen.
Unwarranted, unwarranted negative criticism of political belief of your colleagues.
So let me talk about, maybe just give some practical examples of where orthodoxy, I think, gets social workers in trouble, or when social work education may be compromised by an ideological orthodoxy. Through this, this project that we've been working on over the years, we've, reached out to people of different perspectives, different values. A person who's much different than I, we've had a number of interactions. He asked the question: should a social work intern, a student, be placed at a site where certain things were in place? So let's talk about a homeless shelter. You live in a rural community. There's a homeless shelter. It's run by a Christian church. The Christian church does not want this homeless shelter to become a place where people go to have extramarital sexual contact. And they want to preach Jesus. And so they have the people come in, sign a contract that says they will not engage in extramarital sex. And I think he said a homosexual sex as well. And he also said that they needed to declare their belief and their acceptance, not their belief, but their acceptance of Jesus as their Savior. His question was, should that organization be an authorized practicum site because of the values that they hold? We had a nice little conversation there. And while their values may be different than mine, my question would be, can they practice social work while having guidelines or standards or beliefs about how they go about their service and the services they provide? And they are discriminating because of those beliefs and those practices. Should that be an approved, site? I think that's an interesting question. We had kind of a dialogue back and forth, but the option then is, well, you don't have a social worker at that site, or should those organizations be able to exist because their approach is not exactly like some might interpret the code of ethics. I'd be interested in your thoughts. Should those kinds of organizations be allowed to exist within a social work context?
Well, that particular scenario, the first couple things in terms of an organization saying about behavior, if they don't want people engaging in sexual intercourse on their premises, whether it's heterosexual, homosexual, or whatever,
sure,
they could. That to me seems like that is permissible as an organization to say that we have certain behavioral guidelines. Pretty much every store I go into says you have to have a shirt on and you have to have shoes on.
Yeah.
Is that discriminatory?
Yeah.
Do social workers work in places that require people to have clothing on? That's discriminatory, right?
Good point. Yeah.
But the point that I could see where this is quite a ethical issue is not that they have to then, were you saying the clients attend, the people experiencing homelessness have to declare faith in Jesus Christ in order to receive services?
That was my understanding from what he said.
That to me, that's a sticky point. It's one thing if it's because of various protections constitutionally and legally about the staff that work there, that they may have some type of doctrinal or faith statement that is required, is one thing. But to require the clients to have some type of formal profession and documentation of their faith, to me, that's that's very dicey. That's an issue.
So you would be okay if, correct me if I heard this wrong. You would be okay if there was a staff requirement that the staff could consent to that type of an arrangement, that they had to be believers in this organization, but not for the client. Is that correct?
I'm going off of common practice that I'm aware of,
Yes.
And every agency of that type.
Exactly.
But when it comes to serving the folks, then that's
okay. Because if you are there, that's where I think there's room for the conservative Christian in social work, because those types of organizations are sites where they can serve, where they can practice. Because many faith-based organizations need social workers. They're benefited by social workers. And so to have somebody who, and the Supreme Court has ruled, this is pre, Barrett and Kavanaugh and so forth, ruled that faith-based organizations can discriminate, because otherwise you'd have a Catholic priest wanting to be the Jewish, the Jewish.
No, because to me, the issue there is the power dynamic of a person that's in need of help. And, that the first line of the Code of Ethics is something that I repeat frequently in all my classes. The primary mission of the profession of social work is to help meet the basic human needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of those who are oppressed, discriminated against, or living in poverty. So meeting the needs of all people, and to me, that is a manipulation if you have as a requirement that somebody has to.
So I want to make it clear that I'm not necessarily agreeing with that organization.
Oh yeah, I'm just saying, to me, that's an ethical issue to require somebody to adhere to a particular religion in order to get a piece of bread, or to get a bed for the night, or to have mental health therapy, or to, whatever the service might be. Sure. To me, that would be something that I would think would be a major issue. However, the other piece, it wouldn't be. No, there's.
Let me give you another example. These are just examples and dilemmas that I think it's just, there's value in talking through some of these things. Another colleague that I've recently talked with, she asked a question in a social work class: what is gender? Because the student was talking about how gender could be anything, and so she picked up a marker and said, well, is this gender? She picked up a napkin and said, is this gender? She then asked the question, what is gender? And ultimately, she has not, she's lost her employment. She was under investigation, and she didn't toe the progressive party line, if you will, or the progressive principle of gender affirmation.
I, whether it's the progressive line of that, or if, and people can have different opinions around some of these things, but the asking if a person was a napkin, to me, is disrespectful or dehumanizing.
But that's
that
not
maybe
what
that you said, you picked up a napkin and said, "Is this gender?"
But that wasn't asking. She wasn't describing the person. The student was making a statement or a claim.
Oh, okay.
And this person was asking her to articulate or defend that claim, provide some basis for that. So
I think with anything, even if, if we were in a time machine and we had a very staunch adherent from the 1930s in Austria right now, they're still a human, and we still have to respect them, and we still have to have, everyone has dignity, even if everything within us would be, feeling compelled that, this isn't right or something like this, especially with the hindsight that we have in 2024, right? But that's still a person. I mean, we still work with, I'm in Pennsylvania. When I talk to students about the core values, like an introduction to social work, right? And we talk about the 6 core values, and we talk about those things. And I say, it's all fine and good if you want to work with children that maybe have been abused, have experienced all sorts of trauma and things like this. But in social work, you have to work with the victimizer as well.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to say, oh, we can uphold these code of ethics and these standards and these values with them, but what about with Sandusky? Yeah. Not just the survivors and the various people that he, abused. So you can work with people that you may be very much opposed to something about, some aspect about them, some aspect that they represent, and still be able to practice with them and help them, and know that this isn't about me, this is about the other person, and to be able to help them.
So so to be clear, this person, whom I also have been introduced to, is in a classroom trying to facilitate a discussion, and a student is trying to make a point, and the professor is not understanding the point, trying to facilitate this discussion. Okay. The student is kind of taking over the classroom with, their point of view. Okay. So dominating the class discussion so that others can, so that the professor's trying to regain some order in the classroom. Okay. And says, okay, let's just stop a minute. What is gender? Well, let's just talk about that. Let's talk about what is gender. And, somebody said it can be anything. And she says, oh, is this pen gender? I mean, the point is to narrow this down, right? It can't really be anything, right? So asking is a facetious question. Is this gender? That's not a person. A napkin isn't a person. She's saying a word can it? And look, in other languages, a napkin. I don't know about a napkin, but in other languages, things do have genders, right? So an apple in Spanish versus German. So one has a gender attached to it. So actually our language is kind of unusual that we don't have those gender things. But so I'm kind of, the fact that I'm just kind of confused, because the immediacy was the person, calling a pen a person, or calling a person a pen or something, which it's not what happened. And the reason I'm kind of, and again, I wasn't in that classroom, but I am in my own situation where a research project where, Black Lives Matter was mentioned, then became a reason why social work specifically declared themselves uniquely qualified to declare me and my students racist. Examples of white supremacy, because we asked a question about Black Lives Matter. So it wasn't a person, it wasn't, we were doing we were doing experimental research on, human behavior and the effect of words, on rhetoric. We were doing a study on rhetoric, an experiment, a study that had been IRB approved and everything. My students got death threats because of this. Social work, sent out all campus emails, uniquely qualified to identify white supremacy. So that's why I kind of, so it's like, I'm trying to figure out where is the line, right? Where is the line between academic freedom? Where is the line between, social, you say social work educators run the risk of appearing self-righteous. But at the same time, it feels to me that you're endorsing self-righteousness a little bit by saying we should all embrace that. And maybe what happened to me you feel is correct. So I mean that's okay. That's okay too. There are certainly plenty of those people. So
I only have your perspective on the situation,
absolutely.
And it obviously seems egregious, the way in which you shared that. So I can't really speak with anything.
But you're right. That would be totally from my perspective.
Particular situation, but I think this idea of embracing a liberal viewpoint does not necessarily mean that we say that we are the experts on Black Lives Matter as a discipline, that we have the corner on Black Lives Matter, and Elizabeth, you and all you're associated with are racists. That, to me, isn't the same as embracing a liberal viewpoint. I'm not saying call everybody that you have any issue with a racist.
Yeah.
That's not what that means, right? Like, if I was looking at, if I pull up this idea of some of, if I'm looking at liberal, right? What's a definition of liberal? Like, what are we talking about? If you just look up, even if we would Google right now a definition of conservative and look at
that's complicated,
regular,
isn't it?
Yeah.
And we look at liberal, or if you look at the continuum, right? And we could have experts in political philosophy and thought, and people that are much more well versed than the three of us in this, and to go through all the nuances of this. But looking over the course of about the last 150 years or so that I'm familiar with in terms of literature, and looking at some of the changes over time of the continuum, a liberal perspective is not saying that you say that you have everything and that you are the knowers of everything and all of this. So really, when we said about, we weren't trying to be, we were being sincere and saying, not trying to be treating people in a pedantic manner, not trying to be self-righteous, not excluding everyone's views. We talk about, you need to have space for various opinions, not just showing one opinion, and you need to treat people respectfully in the classroom. we talk about, some of the scholarship that says people have felt stifled and bullied and things to this nature. If there are, not every conservative position, not every ideological position is counter to what we would see as a social work position. But if there are those times in which there are things that are running counter ethically to social work, then it should be addressed, not just to ignore it or just accept that there are value positions and things that would be, and so that.
Well, Dr. Stoeffler, you are obviously wrestling with things that we wrestle with as well. There's no real clear, easy answer here, and so we have talked about your article and some of your thoughts, and we really appreciate that. I'm glad that we've had this conversation. I wonder if I could propose or just tell you, you mind if I armchair author here and invite you to now critique where I might have gone with your research? Would that be okay?
Sure.
So please critique. We're not hurting your feelings. You're not going to hurt ours. What if instead of embracing progressivism, we embrace viewpoint diversity? And that seems to go really well with your second goal, which was that we avoid groupthink and hyperpartisanship. That aligns very closely with that. And so what that might mean is that in social work education, we invite a student first to articulate and define their own values. Self-awareness is critical. Look at their own history, look at their own experiences, look at the things that matter most to them, and recognize that not everybody's going to believe the same and or going to have the same values. Some might want a larger federal response to poverty. Some may want a more localized response to poverty. Some may want to address their poverty needs through local communities, faith communities, civic organizations. Others may want a larger systemic response. But you come to kind of get to know yourself, and then you seek to humanize other people's perspectives. You strive for the dialogue that I feel like we've had here this evening, and that you strive to understand one another's perspective and understand the moral foundations for the beliefs that you are espousing. And then we invite the student to take a look at the code of ethics. And we say, you take your values and you have to figure out, how does this mesh with the code of ethics? What are you going to struggle with? Where does it feel like a good fit? And then they themselves wrestle. They can self-select populations where they might serve. But this all starts within the context of just, social work does include people who are conservative. It includes people who are liberal. It includes people who are libertarian. It includes people who are progressive, who lean in those different things at different times of their lives. And if we seek to humanize, we dialogue across differences, and we stand for ethical principles, we integrate those things into ethical principles, then social work doesn't necessarily have to be ideological as much as it is principled. And social work values can align with conservatism as well as in different ways than they may align with progressivism. it could expand the tent of social workers. It could expand the number of social workers that are available in a world that really needs social work. And perhaps it could bridge ideological divides and a polarized world where if somebody with progressive values can articulate and communicate with somebody who's conservative, and somebody who's conservative could articulate and communicate with somebody who's progressive to find real solutions. Please poke holes in that. Tell me your thoughts.
It sounds really nice. It sounds really good. It really does. And probably most of that sounds like that could be ideal and would be very helpful. Now, with each of those items, kind of fleshing out how you go about doing that, and you did give some, and actually for a advanced family policy class, that's one of the first day activities with the specialization level master students, right, is having them map out all of their values and things, and then seeing how that fits in and kind of doing that. So that is something I'm not just saying that, I literally do that already. So look, there's common ground. Yeah. So where those aspects, because you mentioned, I like the example you mentioned with the addressing poverty, because that was part of my thing as well, and whether it's on the local level, at the civic level, and those things, which would be a more localized approach is a more conservative approach versus a more centralized as a more liberal approach to things, tends to be that in terms of discrimination, differential treatment based upon, and that differential treatment being based upon some criteria that's not a valid criteria in which to make that differential treatment, right? Like race. You shouldn't not allow someone to have a job because of their race, right?
Exactly.
If, when we look at all the studies of the same exact resumes and everything, but they changed the name, or even more so, there was a big study done where they interviewed live. They said, as opposed to the cold call or the resume, but it was live interviews, and they did, and you probably with psychology, you like, yes, I know exactly, where they have the folks that are approximately the same height, same build. They make sure that, verbally and everything else, and then it's more discriminatory. They even have a worse time getting a job with the person of color, even if on paper they're the same and they do their very best to present the same in person. They still get a more difficult job or harder time being hired. In the private sector and on local levels, just as an example, with jobs, it's more discriminatory. With the equalizer, because of additional regulation and policy, is about the only time you see representative employment based upon race is in the public sector. In the private sector, you don't. It's much more discriminatory. And it's the policy that's in place that allows it to maybe help to provide a little bit more opportunity. When we look at the code of ethics, we can see when we say social justice, and I appreciate from a previous podcast of yours that I looked at how social justice is not just the domain of a liberal or there's social justice has many different ways of looking at it. It's not the ownership of one particular group to say they have social justice, But in the area of social justice, in particular with social work in the code, it calls out employment. It says unemployment is one of the primary areas of social justice. So if we had an approach that was more localized, or more in the civic and more in the private and more in these other areas from what we've looked at, there tends to be more issues around access and discrimination than there is in other levels. Does that mean that there's no value in it at all? Absolutely not. I think you have to have a combination of things and, continuum. But just to say, I think viewpoint diversity is very important. I think this idea of humanizing, as you said, importance of human relationships and these other things that we talk about. If we could get along better and not fight as much, I think things would be better. If we could learn to see the humanity in each other, that would be good. But at the same time, those areas, when I talk about things like the whole 6.04 and the ABCD that falls under that in terms of expanding access and opportunity to folks and not being discriminatory based upon X, Y, and Z and these things, certainly liberals discriminate. Not saying that they don't.
Sure.
But as a in certain values, not that other people don't have certain values, but certain values are played up more by certain folks than others. I don't see a lot of conservative platforms or others saying like, let's try to address discrimination. Let's try to, have more opportunities, or some of the things that we're seeing there. The way it fleshes it out is it tends to be not exclusive to, but primarily in the domain of a more liberal perspective. And this is something the Code of Ethics is saying that you have to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would say that it does happen. It just happens in different ways. That if you look at conservatism currently, I mean, it's evolved over time. Group identity versus individual identity. Group rights versus individual rights. Group responsibilities versus individual responsibilities. Where things are at today with, an emphasis on, checking our privilege and checking all the boxes that we do with regards to privilege and those kinds of things. There is a real strong emphasis on groups rather than individual, where there's just an emphasis on group rather than individual right. And individual rights and responsibilities is currently in today's climate a conservative position. Taking things out of context, I think where I would agree with you is that when you take something and move it out of its lane, there's no lane for race. There's no way that can you think of anything where race is relevant? There's no lane for it. And so that's been called out. And so and what I'm saying is that's why racism is so deplorable, is because it's so obvious that racializing anything, where does that make sense? It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in a pluralistic society. So my point is just saying that conservatives do appeal to the Code of Ethics in a way that is different than liberals or progressive people, but there's room to address it. There's room for both.
In the individual versus group, right? We have something called person and environment, and community, and this idea of both. In looking at poverty in particular, that's my main area of focus, and looking at lots of pretty much everything that's I shouldn't say everything, because let's not seem self-righteous. I shouldn't say everything.
No, that's all right.
I've read a lot of things from around 150-year span of time that's been written about poverty in major studies. And, of course, all the seminal works, but looking at this, and there's this, if you want an opinion, if you want a perspective, you can find someone that's going to support your perspective.
Exactly.
But when you start to do kind of like a meta looking at things, then you start to, maybe see a bigger picture. And the vast majority of poverty in the United States is more structural in nature than individual in nature, in terms of like the economy, political factors, other things, where the locus of control for most, not all, but for most of the poverty is beyond the control of the individual, right? Is beyond the control of the individual. But is there individual factors? Yeah. Do individual things, are they're a part of that. Now, most of the American population generally believes that poverty is primarily an individual domain. And they very much see it through a moral lens, and see that if, you're poor, then that is speaking to your work ethic, or that you must be addicted, or that, you're immoral in some way, or, all these other types of things. And if we base our social welfare policies on a more individualistic viewpoint, which, as you said, in modern era, that is a conservative viewpoint, is to be more individualized in that viewpoint, then it will be of some benefit, but it's not really going to address things, as opposed to a more structural. If the source of the issue is more structural in nature, then you need more structural solutions. And that's going to reduce it by much more. That is much more of a liberal perspective on it, but it's also where the data says as well, where you would see a difference. So, our friend Bill Clinton, neo-liberal president, who has the welfare reform in 1996 and everything, and that was very much off of an individual focus. Personal responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Heavy dose of personal responsibility, not a whole lot on the work opportunity side of things. And this is where we cut the programs, where we have work requirements, where you have time limits and all of these things. And it cut welfare by more than half of the welfare rolls. Did it address poverty? Not at all. It did not affect the poverty rate. Now it's just people were still poor, and now they're without benefits.
So are you saying that what Clinton did perpetuated poverty rather than addressed it, or?
Yeah, and I know this is where, this is a yes. He just critiqued a.
No. I don't want to corner you at all. That's not.
Yeah,
that's not my intent at all.
I critique.
It's more principled than personal.
No. I'm just. I'm an equal opportunity critiquer, of. I really am, of whether it's a Democratic or Republican or whatever president. Yeah, no, that was a very neoliberal, and it was very much because that policy was based upon an individualized view of poverty that is applicable. It's not that it has no value, but it has much less value and much less weight than if it was more structurally based in terms of what the plan would be. So the poverty alleviation of it was next to, it was abysmal.
Where it would be really helpful is if we could, if there was, it's pretty clear where folks on the right go too far. It isn't quite so clear where the left, the progressive, goes too far. And I think if there was that ability to say, okay, where are the parameters of democracy, you know, in the United States of America? What are the norm? Where are we looking at here? What is the parameter? Now, we've gone over time, and so I want to be respectful of your time. Elizabeth, did you want to say something? And then
no, it's okay. We can end here. I was going to speak to, you know.
No, go ahead. Just.
I don't really.
I mean, I was going to agree that in higher ed. So, I mean, just to be clear, like, I mean, I considered myself quite the lefty before all of this, and very much at home in, you know, left-leaning Massachusetts. And now, you know, I think, sort of to speak to Matt's point, there is only a certain kind of left. There's only a certain, you know, so that you have to believe in all of this, or you're not, you know, left-leaning ideologically. You know, you don't believe, you either believe all of it or nothing of it. And I think that that's maybe my, you know, so my personal experience with this is coloring, you know, sort of how I read some of what you wrote. You know, so it feels like that tug, like, you know, you have to come further. You have to, you know, I do love the way that you end the article, and you know, thus embracing a progressive viewpoint does not mean minimizing diversity in discourse, but rather provides an opportunity to explore various viewpoints and to find areas of commonality and growth, a liberal progressive ideal in its own regard. And I think if we all, left, right, center, you know, adhere, you know, carried that around in our pockets, we would get along, you know, a lot better. And so I really, I love that. That's not totally at the end of the article, but I think it's a lovely sentiment.
Well, thank you. No, I you know, we'll stand by the things that we put in here. Some of it does seem, can have some contradiction. Some, you know, life is ambiguous at points. It's not 100%, you know, you use the term orthodoxy a lot. I'm not necessarily saying that it has to be, you know, pure orthodox, but what we as a group of writers and what we were looking at is saying that it appears as though social work is housed more in the left when we look historic, not every era and every time. And it's not to say that it's exclusively or only in that area, but that a lot of the threats, and as you mentioned, the threats that we brought up were from the right. We weren't bringing up, we don't have a counterbalance in the article and say, and here's some threats from the left. But it appears to be more left, nested in the left, right? Where you said, where's that line? How far left? You know, how far left would you go? That type of thing. Extremism on either side, this is me, is very scary.
Yeah.
On either side. We are more being pulled in polar, and there's less in the middle, and there's more going to the edges, I believe, now than in the past. I think embracing the values which we have interpreted as being more compatible, or at least expressed in the left, we say that's okay. It's okay to, as far as social work identity and these things, to be over there more, but not to say that that's the only way. not to say that it's all or nothing, not to say that we don't listen to people, we don't include people, not to say that there isn't value and insight on sides, but where, where there are issues that you hold up to the light of the code of ethics and to the other areas where it seems very counter to that, that we should be able to say that. Now, not in an abusive manner, not in a you must be silenced and I'm going to get you kicked out and, all that type of stuff, type of a manner. But we should be able to say that. And likewise, if there are things that come from the left that are also not conducive to social work or to the code, then that also is something that would have to be called out.
That we agree on. So very good. One last question. In a sentence or two, what does it mean to you to be pro-social?
What does it mean to be pro-social? To deeply care about others, being a pro-social worker, if you're saying pro-social in that regard, to help meet the basic needs of all people with particular attention. That first line of the code, how to best do that. How to best do that from an academic side, we're focused on research, we're focused on evidence, we're focused on actually trying to pursue truth in some way or accuracy in some way to best serve those who have needs, which is everyone, to best serve everyone. And so being open to that is pro-social. We talked about education, and I'd be remiss if we look at the word education. And if you look at the Latin behind education, within it, the meaning of education is death. It talks about death. Dying to our presuppositions and our ideas and growing and having growth in life. So death and life is found if you analyze the word education. And I think that we'd all be beneficiaries if we were able to be teachable and learn and grow.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your research, for your article, and thank you for contributing that. Thank you for coming tonight and talking with us and sharing your perspectives. And I think that's evidence of your pro-sociality. So thank you very much for your time and your willingness to discuss. And I hope that we can continue discussions in other arenas, perhaps with your colleagues. Your encouragement, I did buy the book. So
oh wow, okay.
I'll appreciate that, and I haven't read it yet, but certainly eager to continue to learn and learn together. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and it was good talking to you and with both of you, and I think it was a good conversation.
Thank you.